My name is Callie Whitmore. I'm 32 years old. Last Thanksgiving. My father stood up at dinner, raised his glass in front of 20 family members, and said,
Pat, we should have stopped at one child. Would have saved us a lot of trouble.
He wasn't looking at my sister Sloane when he said it. He was looking at me. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been the one quietly holding everything together for over a decade. Their house, their business, their comfortable life. All of it ran through my hands. And that night, sitting at that table, with a fork in my grip and my boyfriend's hand on my knee, I decided to let it all go. 6 months later, my father would call me crying for the first time in his life. But by then, I was already somewhere else, living a life he never thought I was capable of building. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments, and if this story speaks to you, consider subscribing. I only ask because the people who stay tend to be the ones who understand. Now to understand why that one sentence broke everything you need to know what I'd been carrying since I was 4 years old. I grew up in a 2-story colonial house in a quiet suburb outside Philadelphia. The kind of neighborhood where every lawn was mowed on Saturdays and every family looked like they had it all figured out. From the outside, the Whitmores were no different. A father who ran his own construction company. A mother who hosted book clubs and volunteered at the church. 2 daughters. A golden retriever named Biscuit. But inside that house, there were 2 very different childhoods happening under the same roof. My sister Sloane was 4 years older than me. She came out looking like a carbon copy of our mother's sandy blonde hair, wide green eyes, a laugh that filled rooms. She was the kind of child adults gravitated toward. Teachers adored her. Neighbors remembered her name. Our parents lit up when she walked into a room like someone had turned on a switch they didn't even know was off. I was the opposite. Quiet, serious. I had dark hair like my father's mother, and I preferred sitting in corners with a book over joining group activities. My mother used to say I was
born old,
which she meant as a joke but never quite landed as one. I didn't cry much as a baby, apparently. I didn't demand attention. And in a household where attention was a finite resource and Sloane consumed most of it, my silence was convenient. I don't say this to paint my parents as monsters. Not yet, anyway. In those early years, it wasn't cruelty, it was gravity. Everything just naturally orbited around Sloane, and I existed somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, too far away for anyone to notice the cold. The first time I remember truly understanding my place in our family, I was 8 years old. I had entered a district-wide math competition. My 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Calloway, had nominated me after I scored the highest in our school on a statewide assessment. For weeks, I practiced problems at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed. I didn't tell my parents, not because I was hiding it, but because I had already learned that my accomplishments didn't generate the same excitement as Sloane's. The day of the competition was a Saturday in April. My mother was supposed to drive me. I had reminded her twice that week. I'd left a note on the refrigerator. I'd even told my father, who nodded without looking up from his newspaper. That morning, I woke up early, put on my nicest shirt, and went downstairs. The house was buzzing, but not for me. Sloane had made the varsity cheerleading squad at her middle school, and my parents were throwing her a celebration brunch. There were balloons in the kitchen. My mother was making her special French toast, the kind she only made on holidays. I stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. Then I said, "Mom, my competition is in an hour." She looked at me like I'd spoken in a language she didn't understand.
What competition?
I reminded her. She blinked. Then she said,
Callie, I can't leave right now. Your sister's having her friends over. Can't you get a ride with someone?
I was 8. I didn't have a phone. I didn't have someone. Mrs. Calloway ended up picking me up. She drove 25 minutes out of her way to get me because she'd called the house and realized no one was coming. I sat in her passenger seat, staring out the window, and she said something I've never forgotten. "Callie, some families don't see what's quiet. That doesn't mean what's quiet isn't extraordinary." I won first place that day. When Mrs. Calloway dropped me back home, the brunch was still going. Sloane and her friends were doing cartwheels on the front lawn. My mother was taking photos. My father was grilling burgers. I walked inside, holding my trophy, a small gold figure standing on a marble base. No one noticed. I went upstairs, put it on my dresser, and sat on my bed for a long time. My father came up an hour later to tell me dinner was ready. He glanced at the trophy and said,
"What's that?"
"I won the math competition."
"Oh, good for you, kiddo."
He knocked twice on my doorframe and left. That was it. No photo, no celebration, no special French toast, not even a full sentence of acknowledgement. I was 8, and I already understood the math of our family. Sloane was the investment. I was the overhead. The only person who ever truly saw me, was my grandmother Vivian, my mother's mother. She was a retired bookkeeper who had spent 40 years managing accounts for a chain of hardware stores in central Pennsylvania. She wasn't warm in the way grandmothers in movies are. She didn't bake cookies or knit scarves. She was sharp, precise, and deeply practical. She smelled like black coffee and old paper, and she spoke to me like I was an adult, even when I was a child. Every other weekend, I'd go to Grandma Vivian's house, while Sloane stayed home because she found Grandma's house.
Boring.
I sat at Vivian's kitchen table and learned things no one else was teaching me. She showed me how to balance a checkbook, how to read a bank statement, how to calculate compound interest. She taught me that money wasn't about spending, it was about knowing where it came from, where it went, and who was watching it.
Numbers don't lie, Callie.
She told me once, peering over her reading glasses.
People lie, feelings lie, but numbers sit there and tell you exactly what's true if you know how to read them.
At the time, I thought she was just passing down a hobby, an old woman sharing what she knew with the only grandchild patient enough to listen. I didn't know it then, but Grandma Vivian was already preparing me for a role I wouldn't understand for another 15 years. By the time I entered high school, the pattern in our family had calcified into something permanent. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was infrastructure. The entire household was built around Sloane, her schedule, her needs, her future. And I was something between a background character and a utility. Sloane turned 16 the summer before my freshman year. My parents bought her a brand new silver Volkswagen Jetta. There was a bow on it in the driveway like a car commercial. My mother filmed the whole thing. Sloane screamed, jumped up and down, and hugged both of them while I stood on the porch holding a glass of lemonade, watching it happen like a scene from someone else's life. 2 years later, when I turned 16, I got Sloane's old car, the Jetta now with 87,000 miles a dent in the rear bumper and a broken air conditioner. My father tossed me the keys at breakfast and said,
I don't say we never gave you anything.
I didn't complain. I had already stopped expecting parity. What I did instead was start working. I got a job at a coffee shop called The Daily Grind 3 miles from our house. I worked every Saturday and most weekday evenings. I saved every dollar I didn't need for gas. By the end of my junior year, I had $4,200 in a savings account that no one in my family knew existed. Grandma Vivian knew, of course. She helped me open it. She co-signed because I was still a minor, and she made me promise one thing.
Don't touch this money for anyone but yourself, Callie. Not for your parents, not for your sister, not for a boy. For you.
I promised. Around the same time, something shifted in our household that would define the next decade of my life. My father, Dennis, had started a small construction company a few years earlier, Whitmore & Sons Contracting, which was ironic given that he had no sons and barely acknowledged one of his 2 daughters. The company did residential renovations, kitchen remodels, bathroom overhauls. It was growing, but not in a way that matched the lifestyle my parents were living. One evening after dinner, my father was cursing at a stack of papers on the dining table. Invoices, receipts, a checkbook that looked like it hadn't been balanced in months. My mother was loading the dishwasher. Sloane was out with friends. I walked over and looked at the papers. Within 30 seconds, I could see the problem. He was recording expenses in the wrong categories. His invoice numbering had gaps. He had 3 vendors he was overpaying because he hadn't reviewed contracts in 2 years. Dad, you're double charging yourself on the lumber account, I said. He looked at me like I'd spoken Mandarin.
What?
I showed him. Line by line, he stared at the numbers, then at me, then back at the numbers.
Fix it.
Not a request, an instruction. Then he stood up and went to watch television. That was how it began. I was 16 years old, and I became the unofficial, unpaid bookkeeper for Whitmore & Sons Contracting. My father never asked if I wanted the job. He never offered compensation. He never said thank you. He simply expected it the same way he expected the dishes to be clean and the lawn to be mowed. Things that happened in the background, performed by people he didn't think about. I spent 3 to 4 hours every week organizing his finances. I taught myself QuickBooks from YouTube tutorials. I created a filing system. I reconciled every account. And slowly, the company stopped bleeding money in ways my father never even realized it had been bleeding. He never mentioned it again, not once. It was as if the books balanced themselves, as if invoices filed themselves into neat folders, as if the IRS forms completed themselves each spring. I was invisible labor in a house that had already made me invisible. But I kept doing it. Partly because Grandma Vivian told me that knowledge was never wasted, and partly because some stubborn, aching part of me believed that if I just did enough, If I was useful enough, my parents would eventually turn around and see me. They didn't. The clearest proof came on a warm evening in June, my high school graduation. I was the valedictorian of my class. 4 years of straight A's, a 4.0, GPA, and a speech I had written and rewritten 11 times because I wanted every word to be perfect. The auditorium held 600 people. My name was printed in the program in bold letters. I was the first person to walk across that stage. My parents arrived 30 minutes late. They sat in the back row. I know because I looked for them from the podium, scanning face after face until I found my mother's sandy blonde hair near the exit sign. She was checking her phone. My father was leaning back in his chair, with his arms crossed, the posture of a man enduring something rather than witnessing it. I gave my speech anyway. I talked about resilience, about quiet strength, about the people who show up even when no one is watching. I didn't cry. I didn't look at them again. Afterward, there was no dinner, no celebration, no flowers. Sloan had a reservation at a restaurant downtown with her college friends, and my parents had decided to join her instead. My mother said,
We'll celebrate yours another time, Callie.
the way someone promises to return a library book they have no intention of reading. They never did. That evening, Grandma Vivian took me to a small Italian restaurant near her house. Just the two of us. She ordered a bottle of wine the first time she'd ever let me have a glass, and she raised it and said,
To the smartest person in any room she walks into, who will spend her whole life being underestimated by people who should know better.
Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather notebook, brown worn with a brass clasp.
This is for you. One day you'll understand why I'm giving you numbers instead of jewelry.
I opened it. Inside were columns of figures, account numbers, balances, interest rates, names of banks I didn't recognize. I didn't understand any of it yet, but I kept it. I kept it like a promise. That summer, Grandma Vivian sat me down at her kitchen table and told me something about our family's finances that changed how I saw everything.
Grandma Vivian poured 2 cups of black coffee, set one in front of me, and sat down across the table with the kind of stillness that told me whatever she was about to say had been rehearsed in her mind for a long time. Your father's company is failing, Callie.
I blinked. What do you mean I've been doing his books? Revenue is up. He just signed 3 new contracts last month.
Revenue is up.
She said,
But so is spending. Your father spends faster than he earns. He always has. The difference is, for the last 8 years, I've been covering the gap.
She opened a folder she'd pulled from her filing cabinet, the old metal one in her spare bedroom that she kept locked. Inside were bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and handwritten notes on yellow legal paper. Each one documented a loan she'd made to my father. Not gifts, loans, with dates, amounts, and terms that my father had apparently agreed to and then ignored. The total was staggering, over $340,000 across 8 years.
He's never paid back a cent,
Vivian said.
and he never will. I stopped expecting him to a long time ago.
I stared at the numbers. My hands were shaking, not from shock, but from recognition. I had seen the holes in his ledger. I had seen the unexplained deposits that appeared just when payroll was about to bounce. I had assumed they were from a line of credit or a business loan. I never imagined they were coming from my grandmother's retirement savings. Why? I asked. Why do you keep giving him money?
Because your mother asked me to, every time. Patricia calls, she cries. She says Dennis is under pressure. The business just needs one more push. And I give in because she's my daughter, and I love her even when she's wrong.
She paused. Then she looked at me with eyes that were sharp and sad at the same time.
But I'm not going to be here forever, Callie. And when I'm gone, there won't be anyone left to catch him. Except maybe you.
That conversation changed the trajectory of my life. I went to college that fall on a full academic scholarship to Temple University. I majored in accounting with a minor in finance. I paid for my textbooks, my food, and my housing with the money I'd saved from the daily grind and a new part-time job at the university's financial aid office. I didn't ask my parents for a single dollar. They wouldn't have given it anyway. Sloan was attending a private liberal arts college in Connecticut. Tuition alone was $52,000 a year. My parents paid every penny. They also paid for her apartment off campus, her meal plan, her sorority dues, and a new laptop every year because Sloan had a habit of spilling things on keyboards. The total cost of Sloane's education, as I would later calculate, was just under $280,000 over 4 years. Mine cost my parents nothing. I never brought it up, I never compared, I just worked. And every other weekend I drove back to Grandma Vivian's house, and we sat at that kitchen table, and she taught me things that no classroom ever could. She showed me how to read between the lines of a balance sheet, how to trace money through shell accounts, how to identify the early warning signs of insolvency. She was preparing me piece by piece for a job I hadn't been formally offered, but had already been doing since I was 16. By my sophomore year, Grandma Vivian asked me to take over the full financial management of my father's company. Not officially, of course. Dennis Whitmore would never have accepted help from his younger daughter, not openly. His pride was the one asset he never let depreciate. So we did it quietly. Vivian gave me access to the company's bank accounts through a shared login she'd had since the early days. I reconciled everything remotely from my dorm room between classes. I restructured his vendor contracts and saved him $31,000 in the first year. I caught a billing error from his insurance provider that had been overcharging him for 14 months. I set up automated tax payments so he'd stop getting penalty notices from the IRS. I created a cash flow projection system that told me 3 months in advance when the company would need an infusion, and I quietly coordinated with Vivian to time her loans accordingly. No one knew. Not my father, not my mother, not Sloane, not the employees. Just me and Grandma Vivian working in silence, holding the whole thing together with spreadsheets and stubbornness. Meanwhile, I watched from a distance as my parents continued to pour everything into Sloane's life. A new car when she graduated, a down payment on an apartment in New York City when she decided she wanted to try fashion, a credit card with no limit that my father handed her like a gift and that I tracked through the company accounts like a slow-moving disaster. Sloane spent $11,000 in 1 month at restaurants and boutiques in Manhattan. My father didn't blink. My mother called it finding herself. I was finding things too. I was finding every crack in the foundation they were standing on and filling it with cement before anyone noticed. By the time I graduated summa cum laude, top of my class with a job offer from a mid-size accounting firm in Philadelphia, I had been managing my father's company for 4 years, without a title, without a paycheck, and without a single word of recognition. Grandma Vivian came to my graduation. She sat in the 3rd row center seat, and she clapped louder than anyone in the auditorium. She took me to dinner afterward at the same Italian restaurant, ordered the same wine, and said,
"You're ready now."
"Ready for what?" I asked.
She smiled. It was the saddest smile I'd ever seen on her face. For what comes after me?
Grandma Vivian passed away that December, a stroke sudden and merciless on a Tuesday morning while she was balancing her own checkbook. She was 79 years old. The paramedics said she was still holding her pen when they found her. And in her will, she left something that no one in our family expected, least of all me. The funeral was on a Saturday. Cold gray, the kind of December sky that feels like it's pressing down on you. The church was small. Vivian had never been one for spectacle, and the pews were filled with people I mostly didn't recognize. Former colleagues, neighbors from her old street, a few women from her weekly bridge group. They all said the same thing. She was a remarkable woman, and they were right, but none of them knew the half of it. My mother cried. Not the deep, body-shaking kind of grief, but the controlled, dabbing at the eyes kind that looks appropriate in public. My father stood beside her, with one hand on her shoulder and the other in his pocket, his face arranged into something that resembled solemnity, but might have just been impatience. Sloane flew in from New York the night before, and spent most of the reception on her phone texting someone she described as, "A guy from work, it's complicated." I sat in the back of the church and stared at the casket and felt something I couldn't name. Not sadness, exactly. Sadness was too simple. It was more like the feeling of a rope being cut, the sudden weightlessness when the thing you've been tethered to is no longer there. Vivian had been my anchor, my teacher, my only witness. And now she was gone, and I was holding everything she'd taught me in my hands, with no one left to tell me what to do with it. The reading of the will happened the following Thursday at the office of Vivian's attorney, a man named Harold Kenner, who operated out of a narrow brownstone in Chestnut Hill. My mother, my father, my Uncle Thomas, my mother's brother, and I were all present. Sloane didn't come. She said she couldn't get time off work, though I later learned she'd spent that afternoon at a sample sale in Soho. The public will was straightforward. Vivian had divided her estate, her house, her savings account, her modest investment portfolio, equally between her 2 children, my mother Patricia and my Uncle Thomas. The total came to roughly $460,000 split down the middle. My mother nodded when she heard the figure as if she'd been expecting it. My father did the math in his head. I could see it on his face and seemed satisfied. Then Harold Kenner cleared his throat. "There is one additional matter," he said. "A separate trust established independently from the primary estate." The room went still. Harold explained that Vivian had created a private trust 7 years earlier, funded through a separate brokerage account that was not part of her general estate. The trust was irrevocable, meaning it could not be contested or modified by any family member. It had a single beneficiary, me. Harold read the relevant passage aloud. I remember every word, though I couldn't feel my hands at the time. To my granddaughter, Callie Ann Whitmore, I leave the entirety of trust account, number ending in 4719, currently valued at $812,000. This trust shall become accessible when in the sole judgment of my appointed trustee Callie has demonstrated financial independence and personal self-sufficiency separate from the support or influence of her immediate family. My mother's mouth opened. No sound came out. My father leaned forward in his chair.
I'm sorry, 800,000? Where did she get $800,000?
Harold adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Garland was a disciplined investor for over 5 decades. The trust was funded incrementally over the last 15 years and managed conservatively. Its growth reflects standard market returns over that period. But that's more than what she left Patricia, my father said, his voice rising. The estate and the trust are separate instruments, Mr. Whitmore. The trust is not subject to estate distribution. My mother turned to me. Her eyes were wet, but not with grief anymore. Something harder, something closer to accusation.
Did you know about this?
She asked. I didn't answer immediately. The truth was complicated. Vivian had mentioned once that she was setting something aside for me. She never told me the amount. She never told me the conditions. She only told me to be patient. I knew Grandma cared about me, I said finally. That's all I knew. My father stood up, said something about lawyers and manipulation, and walked out. My mother followed. Uncle Thomas stayed behind, shook my hand, and said, "Your grandmother talked about you more than anyone. She was very proud." I drove home that evening with the leather notebook Vivian had given me at graduation sitting on the passenger seat. I opened it at a red light and looked at the numbers again, the account numbers, the balances, the interest rates. They made sense now. They had always made sense. I just hadn't been ready to see the full picture. The trust wasn't accessible yet. Harold explained that the trustee, a retired financial advisor Vivian had appointed, would evaluate my circumstances at the appropriate time. Until then, the money sat untouched, growing quietly, just like Vivian had taught me to do. I told no one, not Marcus, who I'd been dating for a few months by then, not my coworkers, certainly not my parents. And I went back to doing what I'd always done, managing my father's company from the shadows, paying his bills, tracking his cash flow, keeping the lights on in a business he thought ran itself. 5 months later, Sloan got married. The wedding was in June at a vineyard in Bucks County. My parents spent $150,000. I know because I saw every invoice, the florist, the caterer, the band, the custom-made dress, the honeymoon package to Santorini. All of it ran through the company accounts coded as client entertainment and marketing expenses, which meant my father was writing off his daughter's wedding as a business deduction, illegal technically, but no one was watching. No one except me. I was not a bridesmaid. I was the coordinator. My mother assigned me the role 3 months before the wedding, with a phone call that lasted 45 seconds.
Callie, you're so organized. Can you handle the logistics? Sloan is too stressed?
I handled everything. The seating chart, the vendor timelines, the rehearsal dinner, the day of emergency kit. I arrived at the vineyard at 6 a.m. and didn't sit down until 9 p.m. I was not seated at the family table. I was placed at a side table near the kitchen with 2 of Sloan's college friends who had been added last minute. During the reception, Sloan's new husband, Tyler, a real estate broker from Connecticut, with a firm handshake and an empty stare, leaned over to me during the cake cutting and said, "I didn't even know Brooke had a sister until last month." He called her the wrong name. He didn't even get my sister's name right. And somehow that was the funniest and saddest thing I'd heard in years. I kept going, I kept showing up, I kept fixing what they couldn't see. Until that Thanksgiving dinner when my father said the words that finally broke the last thread. The funeral was on a Saturday. Cold gray, the kind of December sky that feels like it's pressing down on you. The church was small. Vivian had never been one for spectacle, and the pews were filled with people I mostly didn't recognize. Former colleagues, neighbors from her old street, a few women from her weekly bridge group. They all said the same thing. She was a remarkable woman. And they were right, but none of them knew the half of it. My mother cried. Not the deep, body-shaking kind of grief, but the controlled, dabbing at the eyes kind that looks appropriate in public. My father stood beside her with one hand on her shoulder and the other in his pocket. His face arranged into something that resembled solemnity, but might have just been impatience. Sloane flew in from New York the night before and spent most of the reception on her phone, texting someone she described as,
"A guy from work, it's complicated."
I sat in the back of the church and stared at the casket and felt something I couldn't name. Not sadness exactly. Sadness was too simple. It was more like the feeling of a rope being cut, the sudden weightlessness when the thing you've been tethered to is no longer there. Vivian had been my anchor, my teacher, my only witness. And now she was gone, and I was holding everything she'd taught me in my hands, with no one left to tell me what to do with it. The reading of the will happened the following Thursday at the office of Vivian's attorney, a man named Harold Kenner, who operated out of a narrow brownstone in Chestnut Hill. My mother, my father, my Uncle Thomas, my mother's brother, and I were all present. Sloane didn't come. She said she couldn't get time off work, though I later learned she'd spent that afternoon at a sample sale in Soho. The public will was straightforward. Vivian had divided her estate, her house, her savings account, her modest investment portfolio, equally between her two children, my mother Patricia and my Uncle Thomas. The total came to roughly $460,000, split down the middle. My mother nodded when she heard the figure as if she'd been expecting it. My father did the math in his head, I could see it on his face, and seemed satisfied. Then Harold Kenner cleared his throat. "There is one additional matter," he said. "A separate trust established independently from the primary estate." The room went still. Harold explained that Vivian had created a private trust 7 years earlier, funded through a separate brokerage account that was not part of her general estate. The trust was irrevocable, meaning it could not be contested or modified by any family member. It had a single beneficiary. Me. Harold read the relevant passage aloud. I remember every word, though. I couldn't feel my hands at the time. "To my granddaughter, Callie Ann Whitmore. I leave the entirety of trust account number ending in 4719, currently valued at $812,000. This trust shall become accessible when in the sole judgment of my appointed trustee Callie has demonstrated financial independence and personal self-sufficiency separate from the support or influence of her immediate family." My mother's mouth opened. No sound came out.
I'm sorry, 800,000. Where did she get $800,000?
My father leaned forward in his chair. Harold adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Garland was a disciplined investor for over 5 decades. The trust was funded incrementally over the last 15 years and managed conservatively. Its growth reflects standard market returns over that period.
But that's more than what she left Patricia.
My father said, his voice rising. The estate and the trust are separate instruments, Mr. Whitmore. The trust is not subject to estate distribution. My mother turned to me. Her eyes were wet, but not with grief anymore. Something harder, something closer to accusation.
Did you know about this?
She asked. I didn't answer immediately. The truth was complicated. Vivian had mentioned once that she was setting something aside for me. She never told me the amount. She never told me the conditions. She only told me to be patient. I knew Grandma cared about me, I said finally. That's all I knew. My father stood up, said something about lawyers and manipulation, and walked out. My mother followed. Uncle Thomas stayed behind, shook my hand, and said, Your grandmother talked about you more than anyone. She was very proud. I drove home that evening with the leather notebook Vivian had given me at graduation sitting on the passenger seat. I opened it at a red light and looked at the numbers again, the account numbers, the balances, the interest rates. They made sense now. They had always made sense. I just hadn't been ready to see the full picture. The trust wasn't accessible yet. Harold explained that the trustee, a retired financial advisor Vivian had appointed, would evaluate my circumstances at the appropriate time. Until then, the money sat untouched, growing quietly, just like Vivian had taught me to do. I told no one, not Marcus, who I'd been dating for a few months by then, not my coworkers, certainly not my parents. And I went back to doing what I'd always done, managing my father's company from the shadows, paying his bills, tracking his cash flow, keeping the lights on in a business he thought ran itself. 5 months later, Sloane got married. The wedding was in June at a vineyard in Bucks County. My parents spent $150,000. I know because I saw every invoice, the florist, the caterer, the band, the custom-made dress, the honeymoon package to Santorini. All of it ran through the company accounts coded as client entertainment and marketing expenses, which meant my father was writing off his daughter's wedding as a business deduction. Illegal technically, but no one was watching. No one except me.
Callie, you're so organized. Can you handle the logistics Sloan is too stressed?
My mother assigned me the role 3 months before the wedding with a phone call that lasted 45 seconds. I handled everything: the seating chart, the vendor timelines, the rehearsal dinner, the day of emergency kit. I arrived at the vineyard at 6 in the morning and didn't sit down until 9 at night. I was not seated at the family table. I was placed at a side table near the kitchen with 2 of Sloane's college friends who had been added last minute. During the reception, Sloane's new husband, Tyler, a real estate broker from Connecticut, with a firm handshake and an empty stare, leaned over to me during the cake cutting and said, "I didn't even know Brooke had a sister until last month." He called her the wrong name. He didn't even get my sister's name right. And somehow, that was the funniest and saddest thing I'd heard in years. I kept going. I kept showing up. I kept fixing what they couldn't see. Until that Thanksgiving dinner when my father said the words that finally broke the last thread. I need to tell you about that Thanksgiving slowly, because the moment that changed everything didn't happen in a flash. It happened in layers, one on top of the other, pressing down until something inside me finally cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that things break when they've been bending for too long. I was 31. Marcus and I had been together for almost 2 years by then. He was a high school English teacher in Philadelphia, calm, steady, the kind of man who read poetry before bed and never raised his voice. He had met my parents twice. Both times my father had called him Martin. Both times my mother had spent the entire visit talking about Sloane's baby, her first grandchild, a boy named Cameron, born that September. Marcus never corrected them about his name. He just squeezed my hand under the table and changed the subject. The Thanksgiving dinner was at my parents' house, the same colonial in the suburbs, the same dining room where I'd eaten 1,000 meals in silence while Sloane narrated her latest adventure. My mother had extended the table with a folding insert and covered it in a white cloth. There were 20 people, my parents, Sloane and Tyler baby Cameron, in a high chair. Uncle Thomas and his wife, a handful of cousins, a few of my father's business associates, and Marcus and me. I had driven up from Philadelphia that morning. I'd spent the previous week reconciling my father's fourth quarter accounts because tax season was approaching and his records were as usual a disaster. I'd found an outstanding lien from a subcontractor he'd forgotten to pay. I'd resolved it with a phone call and a wire transfer from the company's operating account. It took me 3 hours. My father didn't know it had happened. When we arrived, my mother greeted Marcus with a polite but distant smile and said,
"Oh, good, you brought wine."
She didn't say hello to me. She was carrying Cameron on her hip and directing traffic in the kitchen like an air traffic controller, telling cousins where to put casserole dishes, adjusting the thermostat, worrying aloud about whether the turkey was dry. Sloane was seated in the living room, legs curled under her on the couch, scrolling her phone. Tyler was beside her watching football. When I walked in, Sloane looked up and said,
Hey, Cal, can you check if Mom needs help in the kitchen? I just fed Cameron and I'm exhausted.
I went to the kitchen. I helped, like I always did. Dinner started at 5 in the evening. My father sat at the head of the table. My mother sat at the other end. Sloane and Tyler were to my father's right, baby Cameron between them. Marcus and I were near the middle, between Uncle Thomas and one of my father's business partners, a man named Gary, who talked exclusively about golf. The food was good. The conversation was what it always was. Sloane's life in high definition, everyone else's in muted background noise. Sloane talked about the new nursery she was designing for Cameron. Tyler talked about a property deal he was closing. My mother beamed. My father nodded approvingly. No one asked me a single question. Marcus tried once gently to steer things my way.
Callie just finished leading a major audit at her firm. She found a discrepancy that saved the client over $200,000.
My mother smiled politely.
That's nice, dear.
Then she turned to Sloane and asked about Cameron's sleeping schedule. I ate. I chewed. I swallowed. I smiled when someone passed the gravy. Then near the end of the meal, my father stood up. He tapped his wine glass with a fork, the universal signal for a toast. The table quieted.
I want to say something.
Dennis began. He was holding his glass of Cabernet, his face flushed the way it got after 3 drinks.
This has been a hell of a year. Business is strong.
It wasn't. I knew.
And we've got a new addition to the family.
He gestured toward Cameron, who was asleep in Tyler's arms.
Sloane, you've given us the greatest gift a parent could ask for.
He paused. Sloane smiled. My mother dabbed her eyes. Then my father turned slightly, not toward me, toward my mother. and in a voice loud enough for every person at that table to hear, he said,
Pat, we should have stopped at one child. Would have saved us a lot of trouble.
He chuckled. A few people at the table laughed nervously. Gary the golf man let out a loud bark of a laugh, then looked around to see if anyone else was laughing. My mother pressed her lips together and looked down at her plate. Sloane stared at her wine glass. No one looked at me. But everyone knew. The math was simple. Sloane was the first child. I was the trouble. I sat perfectly still. My fork was in my right hand. My left hand was in my lap. Marcus's fingers found mine under the table and held on. I could feel his pulse, or maybe it was mine. I couldn't tell anymore. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up. I didn't throw anything or scream or storm out. I had spent 27 years absorbing moments like this, smaller ones, quieter ones, ones that left bruises you couldn't see. This was just the biggest, the most public, the one that finally named what had always been true. I was the child they wished they hadn't had. I finished my meal. I helped clear the plates. I washed 3 serving dishes by hand because they didn't fit in the dishwasher. Then I dried my hands on a towel, walked to the hallway, put on my coat, and said, "Marcus, we should go." My mother looked up from the couch.
Already we haven't had dessert.
"I'm not hungry," I said. Marcus drove. I sat in the passenger seat and stared at the highway lights bleeding past in long yellow streaks. I didn't speak for 45 minutes. He didn't push me. That was the thing about Marcus. He understood that silence wasn't emptiness. Sometimes it was the sound of someone deciding. When we were 20 minutes from home, I took out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. Harold Kenner's office. It was after hours, but I left a voicemail. "Harold, it's Callie Whitmore. I'd like to schedule a meeting about my grandmother's trust. I think it's time." Then I put my phone away and watched the road. That night I made 3 decisions. The first one was the easiest. The last one would take my parents years to understand. The first decision was to stop managing my father's company. I didn't announce it. I didn't write a formal resignation letter or schedule a meeting. There was nothing formal to resign from because I had never been formally hired. I simply stopped. I closed the QuickBooks file for the last time on a Sunday evening in December, 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. I logged out of the shared bank account Grandma Vivian had set up years ago. I deleted the bookmarked links to vendor portals and tax filing systems. I removed the calendar reminders I had set for quarterly payments, insurance renewals, and payroll deadlines. 14 years of invisible work erased in about 20 minutes. It was the easiest decision because there was nothing to negotiate. You can't quit a job you were never acknowledged for. You just stop showing up, and eventually the absence speaks for itself. The second decision took longer. I met with Harold Kenner the following Tuesday. His office smelled like old books and lemon furniture polish, and he greeted me with the same quiet professionalism he'd shown at the will reading. He pulled out Vivian's trust documents and walked me through the activation process. "The trustee will need to verify your financial independence," he explained. "That means demonstrating stable income, no outstanding debts tied to your family, and residential separation from your parents' household." I met every condition. I had been financially independent since I was 18. I had never taken a dollar from my parents. My credit was clean. My salary at the accounting firm was modest but consistent. The trustee, a retired financial advisor named Dorothy Chen, whom Vivian had known for decades, reviewed my documentation and approved the activation within 10 days. $812,000 sitting in an account with my name on it. Money that Vivian had saved, invested, and protected for 15 years, all for the granddaughter the rest of the family had overlooked. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Dorothy advised me to let it sit, and I agreed. The money wasn't the point. The point was that Vivian had seen me. She had planned for me. She had believed in a future for me that my own parents never bothered to imagine. The third decision was the hardest. Marcus and I had been talking for months about the possibility of leaving Philadelphia. He had been offered a teaching position at a high school in Portland, Oregon, a place neither of us had ever lived, but both of us had visited and loved. The salary was slightly better, the cost of living was manageable, and most importantly, it was 2,800 miles from my parents' dining room table. Before Thanksgiving, I had been hesitant. Portland felt like running away, like admitting defeat, like letting my family win by disappearing. After Thanksgiving, it felt like the only sane choice. We made the decision together on a cold night in January, sitting on our apartment floor, surrounded by takeout containers and a laptop open to real estate listings. Marcus looked at me and said,
"You don't have to keep earning their love, Callie. Some people don't have it to give."
We accepted the Portland offer the next morning. I gave my firm 2 weeks' notice. I packed our apartment into boxes. I forwarded our mail to a temporary address on the West Coast. And on a gray February afternoon, I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a short letter to my father. It said, "Dad, I'm stepping away from the company books. You'll need to hire an accountant. I've left the filing system organized through the end of the fiscal year. Everything you need is in the green folder in the bottom drawer of your office desk. I wish you well. Callie." I mailed it. First class, no return address. My father called 3 days later. It was the first time he'd called me directly in over 4 months.
Callie, what do you mean stepping away? Stepping away from what?
The books, Dad, the accounting, the finances, everything I've been managing. A pause, then a laugh. Not a cruel laugh, a genuinely confused one.
What are you talking about? Things run themselves. I've got a system.
You do have a system, I said. I built it, and now I'm done. Another pause, longer this time.
You're being dramatic.
I'm being clear. Hire someone, Dad. A real accountant, someone you actually pay. He hung up. That was the end of the conversation. My mother called the following week. Her voice had that particular tone she used when she wanted something to go away. Quietly soft, slightly exasperated, as if she were soothing a child who'd skinned a knee and was making too much of it.
Callie, your father told me you're upset about something. I don't understand what's happening. Can you just come home and we'll talk it through?
I'm not upset, Mom. I'm moving.
Moving where?
Portland.
Oregon.
Yes.
But that's Callie, that's across the country. Why would you?
Because I want to. She tried a few more angles. She mentioned Christmas. She mentioned Cameron's first birthday coming up in September. She mentioned that Sloan would love to see more of you. That last one almost made me laugh, but I held it in. We're leaving next week, I said. I'll send you the new address once we're settled.
You're being dramatic, Callie. Come home.
It was the second time in 2 weeks someone in my family had called me dramatic. The word landed differently now. It used to sting. Now it just confirmed what I already knew, that in my family, any reaction I had that wasn't silent compliance was considered excessive. I didn't respond. I said goodbye and hung up. Marcus and I drove across the country in a rented moving truck. It took 4 days. We listened to audiobooks and ate gas station sandwiches and slept in motels with questionable mattresses. Somewhere around Nebraska, in the flat, endless middle of the country, I rolled down the window and let the cold air hit my face and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Lightness. Not happiness. Not yet. But the absence of a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. The weight of trying to be seen by people who had decided before I could even speak that I wasn't worth looking at. Portland was rainy and green and unfamiliar and exactly right. We moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment near Hawthorne Boulevard. Marcus started teaching. I took a remote consulting position with a financial advisory firm. We adopted a cat named Wednesday who liked to sleep on top of the refrigerator. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't check my father's bank accounts on Monday mornings. I didn't reconcile vendor invoices on Thursday nights. I didn't hold my breath every quarter, waiting for a tax penalty notice that would have been my fault if it arrived. I just lived. Quietly, simply, without performing the role of a daughter no one had ever wanted. It took exactly 3 months for the first phone call, but it wasn't from my mother. It was from my father's bank. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon in May. I was sitting on our apartment balcony, reading a novel Marcus had recommended when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A Philadelphia area code? I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. Miss Whitmore. This is Angela Russo from First Continental Bank. I'm calling regarding the account for Whitmore & Sons Contracting. My stomach dropped. Not because I was afraid, because I knew. I'm no longer associated with that company, I said carefully. You'll need to contact the account holder directly, Dennis Whitmore. We've tried Miss Whitmore multiple times. The account has been flagged for insufficient funds on 3 consecutive payroll cycles. There are also 2 outstanding loan payments that are now 60 days past due. Your name was listed as an authorized contact on the account, which is why I'm reaching out. I closed my book, set it on the railing, took a breath. I understand, I said. But I'm no longer an authorized contact. Please remove my name from the account and direct all future communications to Mr. Whitmore. Angela Russo paused. Are you sure the account isn't serious? I'm sure, thank you. I hung up and sat there for a long time. Wednesday the cat jumped into my lap and purred against my chest, and I stared at the trees across the street and let myself feel the thing I'd been bracing for since the day I mailed that letter. It had begun. Over the next several weeks, I learned what was happening back in Philadelphia, not because anyone called me, but because the wreckage left digital footprints I could read without trying. Uncle Thomas called Marcus once, not me. Marcus had mentioned in passing that Dennis was having some trouble with the business. A cousin posted on social media about a family cookout being canceled because things are crazy right now. And Sloan, who hadn't texted me in 4 months, suddenly sent a message that said,
Hey, Cal, how's Portland? We should catch up sometime.
I didn't respond to any of it. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply no longer available for a role I had never been cast in willingly. What happened to Whitmore and Sons contracting was not sudden. It was slow and cumulative, like water damage in a wall invisible until the whole structure starts to sag. Without me, the quarterly tax filings didn't happen on time. Penalty notices arrived. Vendors who had been paid on precise 30-day cycles were now waiting 60, then 90 days. 2 of them pulled their contracts. A subcontractor filed a lien on a half-finished kitchen renovation in Bryn Mawr. The company's insurance lapsed for 11 days because no one renewed the policy, and during those 11 days, a worker injured his back on a job site. The liability exposure alone was enough to threaten the entire operation. My father, to his credit, tried to fix it. He hired a local accountant, a man named Phil Driscoll, who charged $120 an hour and arrived at the office 3 mornings a week. Phil lasted 6 weeks before he called my father into a meeting and delivered the assessment that would later be relayed to me, word for word, by Uncle Thomas. Whoever was managing your books before was operating a system I've never seen in a company this size, Phil said. Custom reconciliation protocols, automated vendor payment schedules tied to cash flow projections, tax optimization strategies that saved you conservatively $200,000 a year. Mr. Whitmore, I can try to maintain what's here, but I didn't build it. I don't fully understand all of it, and frankly, I'm not sure I can replicate it. My father's response, according to Uncle Thomas, was silence. Then he asked,
Who built it?
Phil shrugged. Whoever had access before me. The login history shows the same user account active for the last 14 years. Username C. Whitmore. I imagine my father sat there for a long time after Phil left. I imagine he stared at the screen and saw my name and felt something shift inside him, not guilt, yet not remorse, but the first faint tremor of a realization he wasn't ready to have. That the child he'd dismissed as trouble had been the foundation he was standing on. He called me in June, 4 months since we'd last spoken. His voice was different, not angry, not dismissive, but tight the way a man sounds when he's swallowing something he doesn't want to taste.
Callie, I need you to come back and fix this.
Fix what, Dad?
The company, the books. Phil says the system you built, he says he can't.
He stopped, started again.
Things are falling apart. I need your help.
I was standing in my kitchen in Portland. Marcus was grading papers at the table. Wednesday was sleeping on the refrigerator. Through the window, I could see the neighbor's cherry tree still blooming pink in the late spring light. I'm not your accountant, Dad, as I said. I never was.
What is that supposed to mean?
It means I did that work for 14 years and you never knew. You never asked. You never paid me. You never even said thank you. And when I told you I was leaving, you laughed and said things run themselves. Silence.
Callie?
Hire someone, Dad. A real firm. Not a solo practitioner, a firm with a team. You're going to need forensic help at this point. I can recommend a few names if you want. He didn't want names. He wanted me. But not in the way a father wants his daughter. In the way a man wants his safety net back. I gave him the names anyway. He hung up without saying goodbye. That summer, things accelerated. Phil Driscoll quit after discovering that my father had been writing off Sloane's wedding expenses as business costs of tax fraud that, if audited, could result in federal penalties. Without Phil and without me, the books went dark. The IRS sent a formal inquiry letter in July. A second subcontractor sued for unpaid invoices in August. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the thing no one expected happened. Tyler Sloane's husband, the real estate broker, with the firm handshake, left her. He moved out of their apartment, filed for divorce, and cited irreconcilable differences, which in practice meant he'd realized that Sloane's lifestyle was funded entirely by a family business that was now disintegrating. Sloane moved back in with my parents, with baby Cameron, into the same colonial house in the suburbs where I'd once stood holding a math trophy that no one noticed. My father lost his company in August. The bank seized the operating accounts. The remaining contracts were canceled. Whitmore and Sons, contracting after 18 years, closed its doors with nothing left but debt and a filing cabinet full of records that told the story of a company that had been kept alive by a ghost. But the real collapse, the one no one saw coming, happened on a Tuesday afternoon in September. Sloane showed up at my door in Portland on a Tuesday in September, without calling first. I opened the door and found her standing on the welcome mat with a suitcase in one hand and Cameron on her hip. She looked thinner than the last time I'd seen her. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot. No makeup, no jewelry except her wedding band, which she was still wearing on her left hand, even though Tyler had been gone for 2 months.
Can I come in?
She said. I stepped aside. She sat on our couch, and Cameron immediately crawled toward Wednesday, the cat who regarded the child with the patient suspicion of a creature who had never shared its space with anything louder than a ceiling fan. Marcus made coffee. I sat across from Sloane in the armchair and waited. She didn't speak for a long time. She held her mug with both hands and stared at the steam rising from it, and I watched her face do something I had never seen before. Sloane had always been composed, effortlessly, performatively composed the way people are when they've never had to be anything else. But now her composure was cracking, and underneath it was something raw and unfamiliar. She looked like someone who had just discovered that the floor she'd been dancing on was made of glass.
Dad lost the house,
she said finally. I nodded. I had suspected it was coming. The mortgage had been tied to the business accounts. When the business collapsed, the house followed.
They're staying with Uncle Thomas and Aunt Linda for now, Mom is. She's not doing well, Callie. She doesn't sleep. She just sits in the guest room and stares at old photo albums.
I listened. I didn't interrupt.
Tyler took everything. The apartment, the savings, even Cameron's college fund. His lawyer was better than mine. I didn't even know we had separate assets until the divorce papers came.
She let out a breath that shuddered at the edges.
I have nothing. I moved back home and then home disappeared.
Cameron had given up on the cat and was now pulling himself up against the coffee table, babbling happily at his own reflection in the glass surface. Sloane watched him with the look of a woman who understood for the first time that love alone couldn't keep a child safe, that you needed structure and planning and the kind of quiet competence that she had never been taught because no one thought she'd ever need it. Why are you here, Sloane? I asked, not unkindly, just clearly.
She looked at me, really looked at me. Because I don't know where else to go, she said, and because I need to say something I should have said a long time ago.
She set down her mug. Her hands were trembling.
They treated you like you didn't exist, Callie. For our entire lives, Mom and Dad, they made you invisible, and I saw it. Every time, the graduation, the car, the wedding, that Thanksgiving, I saw all of it, and I never said a single word. Not once. I took what they gave me, and I never asked why you weren't getting the same.
Her voice broke, not dramatically, quietly, the way things break when they've been held together too long by denial.
I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry.
I sat there and let her words land. I had imagined this conversation 100 times in the shower in the car in the quiet hours before sleep. In every version I had rehearsed, I said something sharp. Something about fairness, something about the $150,000 wedding or the silver Jetta or the 100% of college tuition that was never offered to me. In every rehearsal, I made her feel what I had felt. But sitting across from her now, with her son pulling at the edge of my coffee table and her mascara-free eyes red and honest, I didn't feel the need to make her hurt. I just felt tired. The good kind of tired, the kind that comes at the end of something long and heavy when you finally set it down. I know, I said. I've always known. She cried. I let her. Marcus quietly took Cameron to the bedroom to play, and Sloane and I sat in my living room in Portland, Oregon, 2,800 miles from the house where we grew up, and something between us shifted. Not into forgiveness, not yet, that would take longer, but into honesty. For the first time, we were two sisters in the same room without pretense. I helped Sloane find a short-term rental near our neighborhood. I helped her draft a resume. She had a degree in communications, but had never worked a full-time job. I connected her with a recruiter Marcus knew through the school district. I didn't give her money, not because I was cruel, but because Grandma Vivian had taught me that the most dangerous gift you can give someone is the illusion that they don't need to stand on their own. Sloane understood. She didn't ask. 2 weeks after Sloane's visit, a letter arrived at my apartment. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My father's blocky, slightly uneven, the penmanship of a man who built things with his hands and rarely sat down long enough to write more than a check. It was 3 pages long, the longest thing he had ever written, I was certain. He didn't make excuses. He didn't minimize. He wrote about the company, about finding out what I'd done about Phil Driscoll's assessment, about sitting in his empty office and looking at 14 years of meticulous records that bore my digital fingerprint on every page. He wrote about the Thanksgiving dinner. He said he remembered saying it. He said he hadn't meant it the way it sounded. And then he crossed that out and wrote underneath,
That's a lie. I meant it, and I've never been more wrong about anything in my life.
He wrote about Vivian. He said he hadn't understood the trust at first, why she'd left so much to me, and how she'd accumulated it. But now he did. He said he understood that Vivian had seen something in me that he had refused to see, and that she had spent her final years building a safety net for a granddaughter whose own parents had never bothered to catch her. The last paragraph was short.
I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't if I were you. But I want you to know that I see it now. All of it. And I'm sorry I didn't see it when it mattered.
I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it and put it in the leather notebook Vivian had given me between the pages of account numbers and interest rates, alongside the only other things in my life that had ever told me the truth. I didn't respond to my father's letter for 6 weeks. When I finally did, I didn't send words. I sent something else.